Enormous number of books in our field exist because of Professor Fleishman, and we are grateful. Today, his topic is how I think about literature, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Let us welcome Professor Fleishman.
In his talk last month, Amir Eschi evoked Shelley's definition of the poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world. I have taken the liberty of carrying this aphorism over for the title of my talk, devoted mainly to the poet who has been a subject of my research for more than 1.5 decades. But before I switch to him, I would like to make a few general comments, which I believe may better elucidate my approach to literature and literary scholarship. One of our DLCL colleagues has recently voiced an opinion that the humanities very seldom expand knowledge, and perhaps should better not even pursue the goal. Nothing, I believe, is further from truth. Is it true indeed that a lot of mediocre works of literary criticism do not offer anything of lasting significance? But our discipline as a whole, taking in the broad historical perspective, presents the ongoing and uninterrupted process of genuine expansion and deepening of human knowledge. In my view, our profession rests on two tightly interconnected sub-disciplines: poetology/poetics/theory of literature. For me, theory of literature is something akin or similar to theory of music, theory of musical language. And second, the study of literary evolution, or to put it differently, history of literature. No individual author, no literary style, no single text, no genre can be adequately described and interpreted without a careful examination of its place in the context of its epoch and against the background of the writer's milieu and literary tradition. In reality, however, we must be prepared to face a certain fluidity of facts and categories that complicates and impedes an investigation. Any given work may turn out to be entangled in more than one national tradition, or to take part in more than one phase or stage of literary evolution. Without losing our main focus and our main professional commitment, we literary scholars must, in our research, be prepared to deal with a number of contiguous fields, such as history, cultural or political, history of philosophy, history of language, linguistics, history of visual arts and music. It is our ability to contextualize our subject within historical reality that ensures the novelty of our work, the fruitfulness of our approach, and the validity of our conclusions. We, the humanists, pursue the expansion of knowledge as passionately as the scientists do. And such pursuit emboldens us in a constant re-evaluation of the canon, no matter whether we are driven by purely intellectual or pragmatic educational needs. It is essential that we do not give in to the pressures of other contiguous disciplines. While discussing, for example, a poet's relationship with philosophy and contextualizing it within the philosophical trends relevant in his times, we must be careful to maintain our own professional identity and pride. I would like to cite here Friedrich Schiller's dictum: the philosopher is just one half man. I don't know whether I translated well or not. One half man, whereas the poet is the whole man. And that of Friedrich Schelling: in the childhood of knowledge, philosophy was born out of poetry, but once it reached maturity, it flew back to the ocean of poetry and merged with it. There is yet another danger we must try to escape in our work. We have to escape. The aim of an inquiry in our profession should not, I believe, be an examination of the effect a literary work exerts on the reader, which is a quite elusive concept, and definitely not its effect on myself, the scholar, as a reader, but an explication what is contained in the given text and can be compellingly shown in it. The study of reader and history of readership is a legitimate area of research, but it is tangential to theory or history of literature. Introspection and reflection is just one of many weapons, and it is not the major or most powerful instrument or proof at our disposal. We must eschew narcissistic subjectivism, the tendency toward self-analysis instead of an objective, dispassionate scrutiny of a literary phenomenon. Precision and verifiability are as essential for the humanities as they are for science. On the other hand, our greatest challenge is to reveal and to demonstrate the intrinsic, fathomless ambiguity and contradictions of the literary work's message, even when we have little doubt as to its author's stance vis-à-vis one or another issue. A literary scholar, in my view, is the one who is engaged in never-ending excavation of new and new layers of a culture, one who affects a resurrection of forgotten or neglected artifacts. In his investigation, he is condemned to use a vast variety of sources, printed materials, full runs of periodicals, including daily newspapers, manuscripts, and all relevant publications of each text. Such expectations of and longing for archaeological, so to speak, discoveries with regard not only to distant, but to the relatively recent phenomena, reveal dazzling differences between our own habitual views or values and those newly found. Texts that have long been unknown or deemed to be unworthy of attention suddenly start sparking. Such beliefs and principles guided me in my work on an obscure Russian emigre poet, Lev Galitzki. I know that some of you would have difficulty coping with such barbarical names, and I presented all of them here on the board. Lev Galitzki, these are years of his life. It has resulted in a recently brought out 3-volume collection of his writings, which I have co-edited, annotated, and prefaced together with my colleagues from Poland and Czech Republic, Piotr Mitzner and Lazar. This edition has unearthed yet another unacknowledged legislator of the world and explored his place in the history of 20th century Russian literature. Actually, there were 2 separate Galitzkis. One was Leon Galitzki, a noted Polish prose writer and scholar, a historian of Russian-Polish, a good historian of Russian-Polish literary relations, who earned the recognition and respect of the literary establishment in the People's Republic of Poland. Another, a poet, Lev Galitzki, that's the same person, just 2 different names, yes? Okay. In the second generation of the Russian emigration in interwar Poland. A particularly poignant is the fact that Leon Galitzki, in communist Poland, tried to carefully conceal his early poetic endeavors and restless activities on the Russian emigre literary scene, while at the same time secretly cherished his youthful poetic attempts, most of which he had never published. his literary biography provides a kind of parallel to that of Nabokov. Sirin was his pen name, who as a poet was infinitely inferior to Galitzki, while as a prose writer was more successful. In the process of working on this volume, we, the editors, have amassed an enormous amount of material gathered from the private and state library and archival collections scattered in many places in the United States, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Czech Republic, and Israel. Most of these documents were out of reach for Galitzki at the end of his life, and he could not imagine they had survived the world's cataclysms. The textological problems we confronted were overwhelming, just heavy. So intricate and confused was the situation with these prolific authors' extant manuscripts. An aesthetic analysis of the peculiarities of Galitzki's work and an exploration of its place among his contemporary literary schools presented a great challenge because of his irrepressible experiments with all aspects of poetic language that ran the whole gamut of historically distinguishable styles and manners, including a sweeping revision of Russian orthography. The vicissitudes of Galitzki's literary career and the changes and paradoxes of his literary self-identification in the context of Russian culture in interwar Poland raise tormenting questions. Was he a Russian or a Pole? Was he ultimately a Russian or primarily Polish author? Was there any link between the two roles? And how much should we trust his retrospective statements that were advanced in his pseudo-autobiographical writings published in socialist Poland? How were his useful poetic ideas and activities reflected in his later prose endeavors in the Polish language? Incidentally, he did not speak Polish until the late 1930s. What was the relation between his original self-identification as a spokesman for the Russian minority culture in Poland and his later efforts in the 1930s to position himself as the leader of the second generation of Russian immigrant literature? The phenomenon of 20th century Russian diaspora is attracting increased attention of literary historians and is considered to eclipse in its intellectual value today Soviet culture under Stalin. Russian immigrant intelligentsia in interwar Poland was small in numbers in comparison with such major centers of Russia abroad as Paris, Berlin, Prague, or Belgrade. Yet there were large pockets of ethnic Russian or Russian-speaking population in the so-called Kresy, that's the word that I must put here. That's a Polish word. The territories of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus, which were later in September of 1939 annexed by the Soviet Union following the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Local Russian minority communities on the one hand and the émigré intellectual elite in Warsaw on the other had considerable social, political and cultural differences and very divergent agendas. Lev Galitzki was born in Petersburg. Both his parents were of Polish descent, but almost completely Russianized. According to his testimony, he started writing poetry at the age of 12. In the fall of 1916, his mother and he reunited with his father, the army colonel. The family continually moved with the Russian military units at the front in Volhynia, from district, yes, in Ukraine, in Volhynia, from one place to another. It was in Ukraine that the boy witnessed the catastrophic events of the revolutionary year of 1917. The family's vagrant life seemed to stop as they settled down in a small Volhynian town, Ostrog. Very small, smaller than Palosa. Yeah. In the Russian Empire, the whole region belonged to the Pale of Settlement. According to the 1921 census, in Ostrog, with its 13,000 inhabitants, 8,000 were Jews. It was in Ostrog that Galitzki experienced the first powerful explosion of poetic energy, which resulted in his debut in print. And this was a poetry book. Immediately, debut. His first poetry collection was brought out in Ostrog in the summer of 1918, when he did not yet reach 50. All subsequently published Galitzki's poetry books are extremely rare. They were printed usually in a very small number of copies, 25 or 50. But this very first collection of his poetry, published in 1918, exists currently in just one copy, kept in a local museum in Ostrog. One cannot find any reference in this poetry book to contemporary political upheavals. Instead, eternal themes of culture and a play with allusions to various cultural traditions had complete sway in it. In the meantime, in November of 1918, 1 year after the Russian Revolution, two other monarchies in Europe collapsed, Austria-Hungary and Germany. And in their place, new states were coming into existence. No one could predict in what country or under what power Ostrog would find itself the next day. The Galitzkis were playing for time, hoping for the imminent fall of the Bolshevik regime in Russia and for the possibility to return to Petrograd. But political reality dashed such plans as the Russian Civil War was going on and the Soviet-Polish War flared up in 1920. The region passed from hand to hand. After the Polish troops defeated the Red Army in August of 1920, the Galitzki family left Ostrog for Warsaw. They had to hide. It was not known how the fate of Volhynia would be decided in the Polish-Soviet peace negotiations, and whether the region would not become part of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Such prospect augured nothing good for Nikolai Galitzki, the father of the poet, previously a high-ranking gendarmerie officer of the Russian imperial penitentiary system. During their stay in Warsaw, Lev Galitzki's new literary debut, a more visible and more substantial than one in Ostrog, took place. In May 1921, his poems were accepted for publication in Boris Savinkov's, that's a famous terrorist revolutionist, Boris Savinkov's large circulation newspaper Svoboda, Liberty, in its literary section, edited by the literary critic and scholar Alfred, the wonderful literary critic and scholar. More importantly, a few months later, in October, Svoboda's publishing house released Lev Galitzki's new poetry collection, Miniatures, made up of the poems written after the publication of the 1918 Ostrog book. Of course, no poem of Galitzki appeared in print between these two books, except with the exception of this newspaper publication. The poet later mentioned 1921 and not 1918 as the year of his real entry into literature. The divergence in character and style of Galitzki's two first books is amazing. The fiercely anti-Russian sentiment that prevailed in Polish society in the aftermath of the war had forced the Galitzkis, who were ethnic Poles, to go back to Ostrog in 1922. Having rejected both alternatives they faced in Warsaw, embracing Polish culture, still alien to them, on the one hand, or plunging into the emigre community On the other, they had chosen Russian minority status, the quiet provincial milieu in the Kresy. The Galitzkis longed for a sense of intimate, unmediated contact with Russian soil. The borders separating Poland from the Soviet part of Volhynia, according to the new peace treaty, passed through the city of Ostrog, dividing it into two sectors. There began a new and important stage of the poet's biography. In comparison with unusual visibility, the 18-year-old boy gained in the Polish capital his second and much longer Ostrog period seemed mysteriously uneventful. The Galitzki's name had vanished from the print. His next poetry book was to appear only 10 years later, in 1932, after he returned to Warsaw. Yet he didn't stop writing poetry for a moment. In Ostrog Gymnasium, he joined the student literary circle Chotki Rosary, founded by his schoolmate Semyon Vitezhevsky. During 5 years of its activities, the group was reported to produce 47 volumes of poetry and prose. Almost none of them exist now. Handwritten or typed on color-type press. The very existence of such an ambitious and prolific youth literary association in the out-of-the-way place for such a long time is unprecedented in the annals of Russia abroad. The second Ostrog period was for Galitzki also the time of fervent religious mystical quest. He later reported about his frenzied ecstatic prayers, practicing yoga, and going to the extremes of asceticism, starving himself, sleeping on a board instead of a bed. He and his schoolmate Mikhail Rikala were spellbound by Richard Morris Beck's book Cosmic Consciousness and Walt Whitman's The Leaves of Grass, and even they tried to translate it. The boys studied together ancient Indian and Chinese philosophy, medieval Jewish mysticism, and the occult. They founded a new spiritual movement, a new modern religious teaching, which they called Uedinism, secludedness, secludednism, maybe, that was to synthesize the world's main religious and spiritual teachings: Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Theosophy, etc. In 1926, Galitzki resumed his contacts with Alfred Bem, who moved to Prague in 1922 and led there the literary organization Skid Poetov, the Poets' Cloister. For many years, Galitzki kept sending there all his new manuscripts for critique. His other link with the Skid Poetov was a native of Ostrog, Sergei Rafalsky, who after 5 years of studying in Prague had returned home and waited for a permission to repatriate to Soviet Russia, just across the line, border line, yes. Such permission was never granted, and he moved to Paris instead to become eventually a prominent immigrant journalist. In his letter to Bem, Sergei Rafalsky wrote about Galitzki. He is a genuine poet. He produces not kilograms, but metric tons of poetry. There is nothing in his mind but poems and the conviction that he is poet. Almost all of Galitzki's poetic works of this time were clustered in cycles and incorporated in his manuscript collection, Dunovenia Whiff. The collection was essentially to express the author's religious mystical aspirations. This greatly displeased Rafalsky, who was obsessed then with Soviet literature, and particularly with Mayakovsky's violently sacrilegious poetry. Much closer and more productive were Galitzki's ties with Semyon Vitezhevsky, who led his Ostrog friends in the attempts to make their way into Russian literary press. From 1927 on, he brought them to a number of Russian language newspapers. No one, of course, reads these newspapers except we, editors, did it in the search of unknown publications of Galitzki. Полынское слово in Rovno, the Daily Утро in Vilna, and finally, and more importantly, the book weekly Русский голос. I mentioned these newspapers and these places because they give you an expression what were Kresy at this time. None of the city now belongs to Poland and is in any way associated in our consciousness with Polish state. Okay. And finally, and more importantly, the book weekly Русский голос, the organ of the Moskva file party of Russian Orthodox intelligentsia in Galicia. He had also become affiliated with the stronghold of the Moskva file movement, the Stavro-Pihion Institute in Lvov, it exists today also, and enlisted his Ostrog schoolmates to its literary endeavors. The Ostrog poets, including Galitzki, became a dominant force in the Stavro-Pihion publications and provided enthusiastic support for the Institute's effort to confront the escalation of Ukrainian cultural influence and to consolidate Russians on the whole old territory of former Galician Vladimir Rus. In 1929, the immigrant newspaper За Свободу in Warsaw organized an all-country Russian poetry contest. Striving for a broader recognition, Galitzki and other Ostrog poets had sent their poems to Warsaw, but none of them had received any award or attention. In response to this humiliation, Wittiszewski and Galitzki had announced their own literary journal and began soliciting works of Russian poets from various provincial towns in Poland. In the meantime, Russo-Ukrainian ethnic tensions in both exacerbated when on November 21, 1929, street riots took place and the office of Русский голос was ravaged by the mob. This had ruined the plans for the Russian language journal in Lvov. Instead, Wittiszewski had brought out the collection Сборник русских поэтов Польши, the anthology of Russian poets in Poland. This was the first such anthology in immigration, and all of immigration, including Paris, Berlin. And it was a sort of revenge for the defeat the Ostrog poets suffered in the competition organized in 1929 by the Svoboda. Having concluded that there was no future for them either in Lvov or in Ostrog, Wittiszewski and Galitzki had decided to go together to Warsaw to try their luck in the state's capital. In the summer of 1931, one could witness an unprecedented ferment in Russian life there. The celebration of the Day of Russian Culture with an emphasis on the younger immigrant poets' creative work. Before that, they celebrated Pushkin, Dostoevsky, but not these beginners in literature. The passionate debates in Dmitry Filosofov's newspaper За Свободу on the situation in immigrant literature, the first all-country congress of the Russian minority organization to which a guest of honor came from Belgrade, a prominent Russian immigrant politician, Pyotr Struve. He had also attended the Literatury Содружество, the literary society meeting that discussed the mission of the second and third generations of the Russian exile. This was a very painful issue because, these were writers who started their literary career outside of Russia, and it was not clear whether they would be able to artistically survive in the alien environment. It was most surprising that Lev Galitzki, a young provincial known almost to no one in Warsaw by that time, had not only been invited to attend this meeting, but had also been given the floor. Still more remarkable was the content of Galitzki's talk, in spite of the militant political platform of the Svoboda. The championed непримиримость, the uncompromising struggle against the Bolshevik rule, Galitzki preached non-violence and love. The sharp differences in ethical and philosophical views between him and his hosts, did not preclude his close participation in the literary section of the newspaper. Since the fall of 1931, his name appeared on its pages more frequently than that of any other poet. Galitzki gradually became part of the editorial team of Philosopher's newspaper and of its successors. Malva, published from 1932 to 34, and Mech, published from 1934 till the end of 1939. Though always aloof from political strife, Galitzki was willingly drawn in the ideological battles triggered by a high-ranking Soviet functionary, Karl Radek's derogatory comments on Russian emigration that were printed in October of 1933 in the Polish literary weekly Wiadomości Literackie. Together with other members of Philosopher's group, Galitzki launched a campaign in defense of emigre culture. Once again, I remind you of two different phenomena: minority culture and emigre culture, minority life and emigre aspirations. In the course of it, special attention was given to the writers of younger generation. Warsaw, along with Prague, turned into a kind of alternative center of Russian emigre literature, a counterweight to Russian Paris. Lev Galitzki, the youngest member of the editorial board of Malva, suddenly became a highly visible figure. His polemical statements were frequently in unison with those presented by the leader of Steve Poetov, Alfred Venn, whose letters on literature sent from Prague were regularly placed on the pages of Malva and Mech. The arrogant leaders of Russian literary Paris had quickly grasped the seriousness of the challenge the province posed to them. Galitzki's polemic attacks against the Parisian critic Georgy Adamovich, the universally recognized mentor of young Russian poets in exile, were accompanied by the remarkable transformation of his own poetic style. He tried to emulate the archaic features of 18th century ode with the aim to juxtapose its high heroic tone to the decadent romantic vagueness and pessimism that permeated the works of young Paris poets. His embracing the legacy of the archaic tradition was parallel to the similar experiments by Vyacheslav Ivanov, Marina Tsvetaeva, and some other 20th century Russian modernist poets, but was by far more radical than theirs. At this juncture, Galitzki's literary context became significantly broader. In the fall of 1934, a new organization came into being that had no precedent in Poland's cultural life before. The Russian-Polish Circle, Domik w Kolomni, a small house in Kolomna. The Circle, after the name of Pushkin's poem. The Circle, founded by philosophers Weber, Kiryakova, and Lev Galitzki, brought together some leading representatives of Russian emigre and Polish intellectual elite. The prominent Polish writer Maria Dąbrowska claimed in her diary that this is the only place in all Warsaw where good taste still exists. In no other country in Europe had emerged such close bonds between Russian immigrant intelligentsia and the local host culture as in Warsaw. Galitzki was instrumental in equating contemporary Polish poets with the works of Russian emigre writers. Those works became known to the Polish readers in translation much faster than to the foreign audiences elsewhere. Galitzki's own lyrics were translated into Polish by such prominent poets as Julian Tuwim and Józef Czechowicz. Galitzki's close friendship with Polish poets strengthened his position vis-à-vis Russian Paris. To the condescending comments of Georgy Adamovich about the alleged provinciality of the literary tastes of the Warsaw young Russian poets, Galitzki juxtaposed the opinion of his Polish friends, who had an almost native knowledge of Russian poetic traditions, and who were guided in the evaluation of current Russian literature by a broadly European cosmopolitan perspective. For those poles, Russian Paris paled in comparison with the artistic principles advanced by Galitzki and his allies in Prague, Tallinn, and Wyborg. So he cemented the whole front, of opposition against the. Among Polish intellectuals, Russian poetry and Russian young immigrant poetry in particular enjoyed much greater interest and much greater enthusiasm than in the literary circles elsewhere in Europe. Driven by his rivalry with Russian Paris, Galitzki founded in the spring of 1937 his own poetic group and publishing enterprise called Священная Лира, the Holy Lyre. Their anonymously published manifesto cited Shelley's definition of the poets as unacknowledged legislators of the world. As a place of publication on the title page for the group's tiny miscellanies, Galitzki put not Warsaw, but Zarubezhye, that is entire Russia abroad. The Holy Lyre was not to last long. Its activities discontinued just 1 year after the start, and yet it claimed to establish a new literary center in diaspora that would challenge the authority of Russian Paris and be an alternative to it, would redraw the entire map of immigrant culture. This potential failed to materialize, however, because of the outbreak of the World War II. During the war, the contacts among various centers of Russian diaspora came to a halt. When Hitler's troops were approaching Warsaw, Galitzki and his wife, who was Jewish, fled the capital in an attempt to reunite with their parents in Volhynia, who incidentally knew nothing of their children's marriage. The reunion would disapprove it. The reunion, however, could not happen. When Lev and Eva were about to cross the river Bug, they learned of the Soviet troops' march into Kresy and had to return to Nazi-occupied Warsaw. Lev did not let Eva move to the ghetto when it was created in October of 1940, and until the liberation of the country, she remained in hiding. Together with several other Russian writers and journalists in occupied Warsaw, Galitzki made his living initially as a glass cutter in the city devastated by the airstrikes. Working later as accountant for the Russian committee set up by the Nazi authorities, enabled him and Eva to endure the hardships of the war. In those days of ordeal, Galitzki kept working on his large autobiographical novel in verse, Savidets, The Witness, that remained unfinished. It is significant that while continuing writing poetry in the Russian language, Galitzki switched in it to the versification peculiar to Polish tradition, but abandoned and rejected by Russian culture in the middle of the 18th century. He moved from syllabic accentual to syllabic verse. First, he employed it in his full translation of Adam Mickiewicz's Crimean sonnets. This was the fruit of Mickiewicz's stay in Russia. By painstakingly reproducing the original verse form. Thereafter, he used syllabic versification into his own new lyrical poems. The impression is that while writing in Russian, Galitzki started thinking in Polish. It was experimenting with versification that paved the way to his conversion into Polish author and his total immersion into Polish culture in post-war Poland. Thank you.
I believe that Professor Fleishman will entertain questions.
I will. Yeah.
So thank you very much. This was very interesting. And the end of your talk reminds me of something that Bialik, a Hebrew poet, wrote. And he said that Jewish poetry that was Hebrew poetry that was written in exile could never have its own sound because it was forced to hear the sounds of another place and other poetry. And so with time, you can write in Hebrew, but you write in the rhythm and the sound of the place because this is what you hear. Of course, it's a completely different situation for your writer because there was a place in which Russian literature was, and there was a long tradition. But to what extent do you feel that this is a decision to change your rhythms, and to what extent it is just something that happens to you as you live outside the country and you hear for years a different sound?
It is very difficult for me to give a general answer to this question, even with regard to Russian emigre poets who lived in different centers in Berlin and Paris, in the Baltic states, in Yugoslavia. They were surrounded with different languages, and I think to a large extent it helped to them to somewhat isolate himself. This was the case with Nabokov also, who did command, English and French and German, but he felt that he was somewhat amputated by not having the Russian language in everyday situation. So there is not just a question of contact and a presence of absence of leadership. This is not. Something else perhaps is needed for every writer. So there was a kind of artificiality in their existence during the interwar period. Again, this background, the picture that we see in Poland in the interwar period, these Kaniasy, actually, these were absolutely Russian territories with many Russian peasants there who never moved, who could not even imagine that they can be considered as emigres. Or not only peasants, landowners. They had their estate there before the revolution and after the revolution. They didn't move at all. So for them there was no change except, of course, contact with bureaucracy, all kinds of political maybe oppression, and so on and so on. But otherwise, the situation was, so to speak, normal for those who wanted to write in Russian. And that what to some extent can explain such an amazing phenomenon as the existence of a whole new school of younger poets in a stroke in the 20s. We didn't know anything about it until we started working on Galitzki because they didn't publish anything. But then, from all documents, from reports included in the correspondence, from fragments of manuscripts and so on and so forth, and from newspaper accounts in the newspapers which no one reads anymore, yes? We were able to reconstruct a spectacular picture of the existence of the school of emigre poetry no one suspected before. Did I answer your question, or maybe I became too much?
That's very interesting. That answered my question.
What probably there may be a second answer to your question. What prompted Galitzki to switch to Polish poetry during the war? And this is a more difficult question because the war period is nowhere documented well, could not be documented well, especially. That's especially the case with regard to Galitzki, who led double existence and had to conceal the fact that his wife stays with him. And on the other hand, his close affiliates in this Russian committee knew that his wife was Jewish. And you see, the head of this Russian committee knew this very well, but he didn't. He was a terrible person, almost criminal, but nevertheless he didn't say anything. Later, when the war finished, Galitzki couldn't mention this episode of his and his wife's biography. It had to be a secret again. So you see, such was all his life. One of his friends in Poland said that she had never seen such a secret person in her life, her entire life. Okay. Questions? No.
I'm very fascinated by the idea that that the important rival for these poets who are first in Ostrołęka and then the Warsaw Russian poets, the important rival is the Russian emigres in Paris, and not Moscow or.
Oh yes, of course.
And I'm wondering if you can talk about the sort of the situation of emigre culture in general. I wonder if there's a point when, so, well, one is a question that is kind of answerable based on your materials, and another is a question that maybe one would have to speculate. But I wonder whether there's a point when that you can identify, like it's 1924, it's 1927, and suddenly they just, all the emigres just focus on each other. The sort of, what becomes important to them is a cultural network that excludes the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union kind of disappears from view for them. Can you find that point?
Yeah.
And then the question that would require speculation would be, I wonder if one could theorize a model of emigre culture in relation to other sort of diasporic cultures, where they suddenly, at a certain point in the development of emigre cultures, they realize that they just care about the network of those outside the historic homeland.
Okay, first of all, your first question. Yes, the relation between Russian metropolitan culture and Russian emigre culture is a fascinating subject, and this the question cannot be answered with a single formula. It depended on specific cultural political situation. Up to 1924, there was an ongoing and very intense dialogue and exchange between Soviet and emigre culture, and writers were able to go back and forth. Starting from 24, the border were closed. Moreover, the emigre writers became unmentionable in Soviet press, but these relations were not symmetric. So emigre literature always had a very intense interest in what was going on everyday basis in Soviet literature. They followed very carefully the appearance of every new poet, every young writer, and so on. Analyzed it, surveyed it, and it continued until 1939. Moreover, Galitzki, I didn't mention that, he was one of those who surveyed these events in Soviet literature very carefully, and he was the first in emigration who singled out and hailed such a great poet, Zabolotsky. And his article on Zabolotsky appeared a few weeks after Zabolotsky was arrested in Petersburg, in Leningrad, tortured and sent to. So this praise in print probably was not very advantageous to the inmate in Leningrad. So you see, there are really heartbreaking situations here. As to, if I understood your question correctly, concerning the connection between the notion of emigre literature and diasporic literature.
Mm-hmm.
That.
Well, no, I think I'm just curious if your close examination of the relationship between Russian emigre literature in the 1920s and 30s and the Soviet Union can offer you a model, could allow you to speculate about a model that would also apply to some other situations where you have emigre writing or diasporic writing and some homeland to which the diasporic writers cannot or do not want to return?
First of all, I think that all of us can agree that the Russian immigrant culture was an unprecedented phenomenon in the 20th century because of sheer length of its existence and also because of its size. 2 million people yes, not all of them, of course, were poets in a stroke, yes, but it was a very large community, somewhat dispersed between, various countries and even continents, but nevertheless, there were journals that were published in Paris, they were read in Harbin, for example, and so on. So it is, just for this reason, it is very difficult to apply what we learn from our study of Russian immigration to other immigration. The closest, I think, parallel is German exile literature of Hitler's time. But look, that's ridiculous. Just 12 years of existence. It cannot be compared with, 70 years of Russian immigrant literature. But of course, that's that's something that really interests me. There were other immigrant literature, for example, Latvian literature in Moscow. It was entirely communist ideology, and their relations to Latvians in Latvia is a fascinating subject, but I don't think that we can draw any parallel or comparison between them. As to German, I don't have such good knowledge of what was going in the literature, also in various centers, including the United States during that period, not especially from German literature, to speculate about the appropriateness or non-appropriateness of their comparison. This interested me only in one aspect, the role of German immigration in the Soviet Union at the end of the 30s. Yes, because, for example, Boris Pasternak, the greatest poet he was, and also a great fan of German literature. He had very close contact with German poets, communists who lived in Moscow, whereas his political views sharply differed from their, or at least from how they would be able to express their political views in the situation of Stalin's Moscow at this time.
So, thank you for the talk, and I would want to follow up on this interesting discussion about the sociology, if that is the right term, of what literature and displacement. Maybe so you want some general term like that. There's the literature that is in the homeland. Then there's then there are different forms of literature abroad. Then, of course, there's the let's say the diasporic literature, the minorities. You talked about the Russian minorities versus the Russian emigres. The analogy in German would be the exile authors in the United States, as opposed to the German-American community here. Significantly different political trajectories in that period, and that'd be interesting to compare in other cases. But maybe just for the purposes of this afternoon, I'd want to zero in on the terminological distinction. That German cohort is referred to, as you put it, the Exilliteratur. Exile is something different than emigration. So whence this term emigre literature, and does emigre imply that they've given up a hope to return? Because exile always suggested when the regime falls, we return.
Such distinction is not present in Russian scholarship about Russian emigration. We know all too well that all emigres were longing for the return and believed that the Soviet regime will fall shortly, and then they lost this hope in the early 30s. So they, so to speak, embraced both possibilities. One was the hope that was driving all their activities, and the second decade of the interwar period when they lost such hopes. But these were the same writers, the same figures, the same political figures, the same journalists. And do we need such distinction in our realm? I must think more, maybe yes, because I always like, you know, more and more precise definitions. But I'm not sure that it will be easy to categorize the whole array of literary facts, because you see, Russian immigration in Harbin, for example, also different, significant. This was a Russian city from the pre-revolutionary period. Yes, in Harbin. But then we have Shanghai. That was not a Russian city, but was Chinese city. And once again, there of course was a very intense contact between these two cities, between the Russian communities of these two cities. But how we can apply such general terms and definitions to the whole variety of phenomena is not clear for me right now. But thank you for turning.
Sure.
Yeah, that's yeah.
I mean, this is sort of a response to your question as well. But I think it matters that that the Russian immigrant literature was not purely in Russian. That there were many people from the Soviet Union, living in Berlin, Vienna, writing in Yiddish, who would have thought of themselves as émigrés, who were referred to as émigrés, but who in 1929 or 1930 went back to the Soviet Union because Yiddish culture was so well supported there and so poorly supported elsewhere. Yeah, and it flourished there, and they flourished until they were rounded up and shot. But it's such a complicated, this question of what is an émigré, what is an émigré literature, are you going to go back, is something that kind of switched from year to year, and depends so much who you were.
Well, I'm asking, what's the etymology of immigrant? When did that term start being used, and was that the only term that was used?
No.
But
fugitives.
What do you say in Russian?
Fugitives. Initially, they called themselves fugitives, but it became clear by 1920 and 1921 that emigrant in Russian is a more appropriate term. By the way, they preferred another term for their situation, that is Russia abroad, a second Russia, rather than emigration. Yeah.
Do we have other questions? No, let us thank our speaker.